Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. Welcome to October, when tales of terror become timely and the days take a fearful turn towards Halloween. In horror movies, 3 words can be enough to strike fear into someone, like, "It's behind you," "Check the basement," or "No cell service." AppSec can strike fear with its own 3 words, like, "Let's deploy now," "Top 10 list," "Written in Perl," and Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Which means this week we take another deep dive into the news. Don't split up and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. 61%. That's how many U.S. businesses experienced a software supply chain attack in 2023, according to Gartner. This attack surface is constantly expanding. To secure your software supply chain, you first need to control it. JFrog offers an end-to-end platform that manages and controls the binaries and DevOps processes across the entire software development lifecycle. With JFrog, you can deliver trusted software with speed. Visit securityweekly.com/jfrog to learn more and take control of your software supply chain today. This is episode 303, recorded October 14th, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with 2 words, John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Those are not scary words.
No, they're not scary words. We're always happy to have you here. 2 other words that are also not scary is Kalyani Pawar joining us for co-hosting this week. Hello, Kalyani.
Hello. Also, I promise they're never going to be scary. Only friendly.
Scary, only friendly. Well, as I noted, we are diving right into the news this week, and I thought because it's episode 303, which feels very Halloween themed and some good Halloween-esque numbers, that's why I thought of, things that could be scary in 3. But before I hear each of your versions of fear and AppSec fear in 3 words, I'm curious, we're halfway through Cybersecurity Awareness Month. What have you learned? And maybe we'll start with Kalyani. What have you become more aware of now in this month of October?
That we're just never aware enough about security, be it any kind, AppSec or enterprise. We're just never aware enough. And the landscape keeps changing every day. The threats keep changing every day. You're just not aware enough.
Not aware enough. Very meta and recursive. I love it. And John, have you learned anything? Or sorry, have you become cybersecurity aware so far this month?
Listeners, we're sticking true to what we believe in. We brought in a new co-host, and she's just as negative as we are. Excuse me. My 3 words that are scary for a month right now are home rolled encryption.
Oh no. Is it quantum safe? I'm not sure. Yeah, that's going to be tough.
I forgot about quantum safe.
Quantum safe. But what we didn't forget was to pull in a bunch of fun articles on a variety of topics, I think. But as always, I try to pull out a theme. We're vuln heavy again this week. And John, you pulled out some vulnerabilities. Let's start with yours because I said quantum. Let's go with the letter Q into Qualcomm, which did have a bunch of vulnerabilities. I think in a lot of firmware, which always makes it tougher to update all of that Android out there. And maybe lots of Android is another 3 words that's scary. But I don't want to step on your article. What stood out to you for this one?
Man, there's so much in this article you can step all over, and we still have stuff to talk about. 5 CVEs in proprietary software. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Looks like 10 plus in some of their open source. So this was partially kicked off by there was a cyber attack going on against some Android devices with Qualcomm chips. I believe this affects 64 different chips, if I got that right. Yeah, 64 chipsets. So it's sort of broad. And what the fun part here is this is actually just a monthly security bulletin. This is not quarterly or some sort of like longer period of time. They sort of got hit pretty heavily. But yeah, there's a mixture of sort of everything in here that you could sort of possibly think about. There's some code execution. issues with cameras. There's one you were thinking about earlier. They call it radio interface layer, which is why I didn't see it when you mentioned baseline off air. Performance related things. It's really, it's long. Lots of reading. If you want to sort of go and practice your CVSS calculation, it's a good place to go and look at them. But a little bit of hardware, so I brought it in that point of view.
A little bit of heartburn. And yeah, it was that baseband connection that made me think of our article last week where Google was talking about Pixel and a lot of the high level approaches they take to just secure coding in the sense of having stack canaries, having ASLR, having a lot of just sanitizers applied at compile time, things like that. And they were pointing out that there is a struggle, or maybe we'll just say there is a challenge to use more business-friendly language in not only keeping that baseband firmware up to date, but also deploying it. So this is one of those things that's a challenge within the world of Android is, okay, we know about these Vulns. The Vulns have patches, but at what point does your device actually receive that patch? And hopefully it can be delivered over the air, but you got to have you can't be that horror movie with no cell service. That's the only thing I can add there.
Three scary words. It's too late.
It's too late.
It's too late.
Good answer.
It's never too late. I think we've got a bit of a pattern going on here today, Mike, with a few of these articles where the words going through my head is like, why wasn't this tested ahead of time? So...
And thank you for saying that, because I did dive into two articles, one about Ivanti and some Perl-based code. And then we've actually, for the first time, I think, covered Magento, which is it's always like every month or so, maybe every 2 months. It's sort of Adobe releases a new critical update. Sort of Magento is the new Flash, if you will. Poor code there, but that's PHP code, but it's also new code. And poor Kalyani, you're going to see that. Do we only talk about dead languages around here? Is the Latin or Greek or hieroglyphics? Well, Greek is actually not dead. Sorry, or hieroglyphics coming in here too. But the reason I pulled out Ivanti as I was reading through this, and it's a wonderful write-up, very, very nice, and it's pointing out, they say, oh, here's a .admin.cgi file. And at first I was like, it's been a while since I've seen .cgi, and that's because this is also some Perl code, which longtime listeners may be familiar with my lack of fondness for Perl. The Perl obfuscated contest is an oxymoron. But that aside, the Perl, what stood out is that this does look like legacy code. And it's sort of like, how do you deal with code that hasn't been looked at in a while, or maybe the threat model hasn't been updated? Because another thought that comes through my mind reading this is that ostensibly this website is used by admins to do things like certificate signing requests. They're doing very security sensitive activities. It should be just admins accessing this, and admins shouldn't be the ones that are then trying to further compromise your device, but there's a lot of shouldn't in there. And that's a lot of assumptions that I think threat models and security folks don't like to just rely on. They want better boundaries. But wow, there's some other things about how this exploit unfolds that I want to get into. But maybe Kalyani, I don't know, you looking at this, just what was your reaction to seeing old code, or maybe generalizing this when you do see legacy code? How do you prevent that code from being, legacy, or getting rid of that legacy code in the first place?
I probably have said this before. I'm going to say it again. Documentation is a thankless job, and I feel like code should be kind of self-defining. I feel like when we're dealing with legacy code, one of the biggest problems is we spend a lot of time understanding it than writing it. And I think if I'm spending a lot of time understanding it, I would rather do a favor for everyone else and explain what the code is about. And I think another thing I want to talk about was like isolating legacy services as much as we can. That also turned out to be useful. I mean, especially if you're dealing with like admin signing certificates or something like that, I'd rather isolate that and write as many good tests as you can for the code to get better every day. Yeah,
and that's what was weird. I say weird. What was fun for me to read was there were just some basic web problems in here, like CRLF injection, but it also on the back end was basically using Perl to call right into OpenSSL. It's using OpenSSL to do a bunch of certificate shenanigans that's the technical phrase for this. But what was fun is that it was using CRLF injection to essentially upload and influence the configuration for OpenSSL so that it could influence OpenSSL to load an arbitrary SO. It's sort of the LD preload, if you will, of type of attack. It's just doing it through a text-based config file to eventually get into arbitrary code execution, which just in my mind is a lot of things here that stand out. In retrospect. Hindsight is always easier. We could have had a better secure design. We could have had better vetting that is this a text file I'm trying to load? Or is this a .so throwing errors? But then, of course, you have to pay attention to those errors. A lot of things about, should we be calling into the command line, or should we be calling into better APIs for doing all these certificate-based activities? So there's a lot of opportunity to do better here. But one of the things is, if it works and it's in Perl, it's sort of like, how do you convince the team to go back and rewrite this because it might be insecure? And this is one of those things that John always very rightly, I think, pulls me back from the edge, where I'm always like, oh, well, we should rewrite this, and it's not a memory safety issue, but we could do this in Go, we do this in Rust, do this in something modern that's actually more readable. And I'm not sure if this is an example, John, where Perl is just a little bit too tough, or this is what else could we, or should we have been doing here if we were the AppSec team, advising these devs?
I think Kalyani went the right direction when she was talking about just isolate that thing and put it over there and just let it do its thing. I was just double checking as we had forgotten that Adobe picked up Magento for $1.6 billion in 2018. The reason I'm sort of mentioning that is, okay, they paid 1.6 for a bunch of Perl code, not completely. Or
that's the PHP, yeah. The Ivanti was Perl.
PHP.
Sorry.
I'm sure some Perl in there too. I have faith in them.
True.
But the point being, I'm sort of looking at this from a different point of view. And Kalyani, when you were on before, you were talking a little bit about like security for startups. If you are a founder or an early stage startup, and one of the things you should be thinking about is like, who's going to acquire me, or what's my exit plan? Do you look at the security, and Adobe's doing good in security recently, so I don't want to make this be a total bad thing, but how much do you actually think about the company that's going to acquire you, what type of security practices and standards they have, and then either increase or decrease your security budget? I wonder how many, if anyone, actually thinks about that.
I don't, as much as I want to make a positive comment on this, trailing on the negative mood. It's often overlooked. Let's be honest. It's often overlooked unless it's like a security product, right? I think that's the only time they care a lot about security. There's also been times where the founders are trying to raise funding, and there's only been I think handful number of times where I've seen them actually submit security questionnaires to the investors. And so, it's often overlooked. But it's getting better. There's hope. It's getting better. I've been seeing increased questionnaires coming through. But I feel like the baseline, the basic hygiene, the basic housekeeping, I think that every founder should keep in their mind, right? Don't have have MFA. I think that's really basic, and I don't think any founder has to, in the name of velocity, let's just not, compromise on something this basic. But yeah, it's getting better. I'm starting to have more security-aware conversations. There's hope for a bright future.
Oh, we do have some optimism, but it's like a horror movie. There's always going to be that one final sting. We might have a false ending here. But Kalyani and John, you're bringing up one of those things about, in a way, sort of that due diligence. You're a startup or there's an acquisition. There does come a due diligence step of, what does this application look like? How horrible, how difficult, how easy will it be? You could frame that in different ways to secure, to handle. And in this Perl code, I thought that was kind of like, oh, this is legacy code. Like, do we even have anyone who can read Perl, let alone wants to read Perl? In the Magento example, this is more modern application. John pointed out it was, at least, it was acquired by Adobe back in 2018, so 6+ years old, but it still has a software architecture that looks like it has some rough edges. And in this particular example, once again, it was really interesting to me because you had some PHP code, which kind of is neither here nor there for a moment, that is handling a HTTP request, like a POST request, that's sending a JSON string. And in that JSON string, it has serialized XML that is then turning into an XXE. So you have this weird parsing of JSON, XML, kind of like, why would you do this? Why is this happening? And that's where my mind was going in the sense of that architecture design, that this almost feels like a self-imposed security issue. And the article, to its credit, I should say, does also point that out before I even did.
I mean, that to me sounds like a dare over a few beers on a Friday night, right? Hey, I got an idea what we can do in the code.
Well, that's here's an idea. So there's another article about Lima. So Lima completes fuzzing audits, and this is from the CNCF. And I do follow the CNCF because it does a lot of really cool work. They have some neat incubators we've talked about. I know, John, you've been involved with the CNCF as well. So really neat things there, good connections. I do have to admit, despite having a podcast, I don't pretend to be an expert on everything. And I wasn't familiar with Lima, I know. But the part that did catch my eye was it completes a fuzzing audit. So cool, I love fuzzing. And I was seeing, it did find the fuzzing was successful, found several issues in third-party libraries. But then there was almost this aside that I said, wait, what? And this feels like that bet over a couple beers that you were kind of mentioning, John, because what the developers discovered is that there were at least 3 different libraries that were being used to parse YAML. And then one of the libraries that was parsing YAML actually did an intermediate marshalling of YAML into JSON, did all the manipulations and shenanigans, because that's a fun word, in JSON, and then turned it back into YAML. And again, that just seems like, wait, what? What's going on here? And this is, to be fair to Lima, this is the third-party code. They're off doing wonderful things for their own software. But wow, who knows what that third-party dependency is? So my brain is slightly broken, so one of you are going to have to pick up the ball here because I don't know where else to go.
I'll start with Lima. Lima's pretty cool. If you need to quickly sort of spin up a VM from command line, it's sort of like a lighter weight open source, more modern version of VirtualBox, in that at least on Mac it can use the Mac VM. So yeah, I was using it for a while later. If I needed like a VM for Docker containers or different things like that, you just Lima cuddle, do your thing, and there you go. So glad to see that they're improving the security of it if it's doing that type of stuff. And I was going to say this, Mike, on the end of the last one when I was making the snarky comments, that I wonder if there was actually some use case where someone knew a library in this case, the intermediate was JSON, right? So they had a library that could easily do some manipulation for them in JSON. So, but they've got YAML. So, well, hell, let's maybe switch over to do crunchy and then put it back. It's, I think most of us would say it's not a great idea. How many times we've talked about, like, if either sound files or images or anything, once you start changing those formats, that's where the bugs start coming in. And this might sound like not a bad idea, but yeah. Glad to see they found it.
And it's one of those areas that anytime you say parsing, throw that fuzzer against it. And that's where absolutely throw that memory safe language on top of it, because parsing gets into those gnarly spots of it declared a length, but the amount of bytes you've been given are either under that length or over that length. So you get those integers, wonderful integer overflows and underflows, or just other types of things that can go wrong, especially if, like, here's a 3 words, parsing with regex. Regexes aren't for parsers, they're for just pattern matching. So there's a lot of things where basically my point is parsing is a very security sensitive area, and often you're parsing user generated content. John just pointed out video, audio, etc., or images for that matter. So Yeah, that's where throw that in there. And Kalyani, I know you've got something you want to add here.
Yes, I will, however, say that, I really like it when projects are like really transparent about things like this, and I really like that Lima has a public record where they talk about all the crashes that they had. So I guess +1 for transparency, and maybe we're all biased for Lima.
Well, and if the, it is great. We do celebrate
Yeah.
transparency here when talking about breaches, postmortems, things like that, and reading the comments, because I was reading the comments last week and a couple weeks before, just looking at how patches come about, etc. But John, we might also have to look at comments for other reasons, because there might be good comments, but there might be evil comments. What evil lurks out there, John?
I thought this was a fun one. So we're sort of AppSec adjacent, just from the point of view that, well, I guess I can bring it back to AppSec. Sure, I can bring anything back. But so what we got here is some malicious users. If you want to, phish or attack someone out the standard sort of email things, which people do nowadays, or text or what have you, you got to store your payload somewhere, right? You can put them on websites, you can put them in GitHub repos, you can put them on Dropbox, anywhere you can store something, right? You can do this. But what the individuals figured out in this particular case is can actually store those binary blobs in just comments on GitHub issues or GitHub pull requests. So you don't have to have ownership of it. I mean, you have to have a username, but right. So you don't have ownership of it. You can find a nice quiet project with not a lot of people are actually working on. Just go and upload your thing there. You can link to it, and then you deploy out your phishing, as I said, or whatever type of attack you're doing, drive by, and the blob is nicely being served out by GitHub. So I thought that was the level of creativity there. I thought was really interesting. Does the same type of thing work on some of the other public code repos? I'm sure it does, one way, shape, or form, or another. But yeah, I mean, you can tie it back to AppSec, besides being, like I said, AppSec adjacent. Should you be allowing large binary uploads into a comments field? Or maybe should you be checking? I think we'll have another patent here coming up later, but should you be doing some sort of monitoring or watching metrics of how many times that one comment is being hit? Maybe that might be a sign that something's off. But yeah, anyways, I presume it's fixed by now. I'm not positive, to be honest. But
Yeah,
I thought that was sort of neat.
It's a great thing to highlight, because how innocuous is going to GitHub, for example, and that's a destination that you actually want, and it to enable it's desirable for your developers, for your company, typically to go there, because they're looking for some third-party dependencies, they're using it for their own code, etc. So it's a wonderful source to be able to get back to go buy that cybersecurity awareness training. So you set this up as well, as rather than telling people, well, do some RFC 3916, I can't remember the one, but inspect that URL for correctness and make sure the evil bit has been, whether that evil bit has been set in the URL. Do you trust it? Is a little handbag of security there that's also just so happens to look like a lock? Is this trusted? Or we could say, am I fully patched? How resistant is my system to malware? Because that's what the real problem is that's coming from here, coming through phishing. Another just side comment, I'll have to throw it in after the episode. Microsoft was also coincidentally talking about a resurgent in what you mentioned, John, things like Dropbox or other file sharing areas that are used for payloads or associated with phishing. So it's the type of thing, rather than having this be, oh, look at this strange geographic, TLD that we have. It's just a normal innocuous destination that just so happens to be delivering something nefarious. So it's one of those things that I think that your question comes down to, how do we protect against it? And my mind went to protecting the user, keeping up to date, having, passkeys or phishing resistant credentials. But you were pointing out, how does the app owner or the resource owner also then take on some of that burden, so we don't always push it onto users? Speaking of pushing onto users, we can also push code into cloud environments. And Kalyani kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, talking about isolation and with containers and so on. And there's an article from Google, from the Google Bug Hunters, talking about protecting large language models. And the topic here it wasn't so much about LLMs, really. It was more, I think, the gist of the article is about protecting code execution in shared environments, or call it multi-tenant environments, or sandboxes, or other ways where you're actually saying that your application is designed and intended to execute code. It just so happens to be the code is being executed to train LLMs. And I was just being pedantic, admittedly, about that, because not everything is LLM, or LLM security quite often looks like software security. There's nothing necessarily special about the AI. But this was a really, all of that preamble aside, really well-written article. It points out a lot of good examples about secure design choices and things that their security testing, their own internal red team, discovered about things like that LD preload that I mentioned before. You could inject some environment variables, and if you can do that, that is a classic type of attack to execute arbitrary code. I think we even saw that a fun technique around old school shell shock as well when that was coming out. But Kalyani, let me throw over to you and see, like, what were there other things about this that brought to your mind cloud containers or that isolation aspect?
I don't know, but like having worked at startups, my first thing was let's not run root. That's the first thing that came in my mind because of the freedom that everybody uses in startup, and then also there's this thing about velocity, and we can be late, and we want to make everyone happy. The first thing that just came to my mind, honestly, was let's not run root, and then. Also, yeah, you're right. I feel like the article, more than talking about LLMs, talks more about software security. And I think these are like very basic principles of software security with respect to like multi-tenancy also, right? But yeah, top thoughts in my mind.
Yeah, and John and I talked about 3 or 4 months ago about an article from Thinkst Canary, who their approach to architecture was basically multi-tenancy was run a complete stack in a complete virtual stack for every single customer. And that was the right choice for them, even though they pointed out it had a trade-off of engineering overhead. It wasn't necessarily the most efficient. Google, on the other hand, is pointing out this type of approach. And John, we could talk about this, but I also want to pull in another article you had about remote execution vuln in GitLab that is similar to a situation where you actually are expecting customers to execute code. But of course, you just want them to be able to execute commands in a constrained way, not just to be arbitrary RCEs.
Yeah, go stick with the. Sorry, I'm going to stick with the previous one for a tiny second.
Yeah,
because what's really interesting to me about it, if you think about LLMs, they're resource hungry. Mm-hmm. So whether you're either doing the training phase or even if you're doing inference, and it's interesting to think about one of the magical tricks which cloud providers have to do is how do you make something multi-tenant, right? So how do you let's be honest, oversubscribe whatever that resource is that you're selling. How do you do that? So I'm trying to figure out if you're doing this for LLMs, if you've got call it a 20 gigabyte model, you can't be flipping that in and out of memory every time someone goes to do inference. So are you running your VMs at overcapacity? What I'm getting at is here, one way or another, it comes back to the idea of the tenancy you're talking about. And there has to be some sort of games going on with this, I'm guessing. I don't mean in a bad way. I'm just saying they probably have figured out some sort of thing to do. And that's where this becomes sort of scary. It's not so much the standard LLM itself or how you're modifying it or what you're doing with it, but like, can you either get out of that jail, or can you use more resources than you need to, or can you be that noisy neighbor and DOS your neighbors? So that's interesting to me. And also it feels like they were doing this in prod, not pre-prod before it launched. So that sort of, But anyways, I'll go over to the other one. So yeah, GitLab. Well, let's see. Again, this is one of those weeks where we have releases with a bunch of different vulns in it. This one's 2, 4, 6, looks like around 10. The big one, as I mentioned, run pipelines on arbitrary branches. This feels like it came out earlier this summer. Maybe it was discovered, but they just released the patch now. But beside that, yeah, some SSRF in their analytics dashboard, viewing diffs of a merge request when conflicts can be slow. So a variety of different things that were found in here. They patched them pretty quickly. I believe, like I said, I want to go back now and sort of check. Like, well, I think we might have even talked about the GitLab, the main issue before. But yeah, this is one of those ones interesting. You can choose to run. I mean, I'm still sort of leaning towards this after just talking about cloud. For a code repo, I'm still really tempted to run it locally if it's like my business, right? It's more work to patch and update it, but at least you can do that easily with GitLab. With GitHub, you can do it. It's going to cost you more money. But, I mean, at the same time, GitHub has a pretty strong... it comes back to that idea I was talking about before with if you're a startup and you're going to go, what's your security model based off who's going to acquire you? GitLab's doing great things. They really push what people should be expecting for security features in your code repo. GitHub, on the other hand, seems like they're doing a pretty good job of keeping things secure. And we're not seeing, it's not very often, if at all, like the closest we came today or probably in the last few months about talking about GitHub and security was that storing a binary blob somewhere. So where I'm going with this spew of words is like, this seems like I trust them, that I don't have to run it on-prem. I don't know. It's sort of, that's the trade-off there on that sort of operational aspects of AppSec. Where do you run this, or who do you trust to run in a cloud?
Yeah, and it's funny you say that because my immediate feeling was, I like that idea of transfer of risk to GitLab, for example, or we could generalize that to like the cloud environment to be like, if please keep that infrastructure, that control plane, if you will, behind the scenes patched for me. And we've talked about, like, I think it's CloudDB, that cloud vulnerabilities aren't necessarily tracked, or they do happen and they get fixed. But the reason I'm taking this is that sometimes they get fixed for this point forward. But if you have existing resources, that won't get retroactively applied. Now, the GitLab example, it's going to be retroactively applied because we're just talking about this patch for the repo hosting service. So that's a good thing. But I'm curious too, Kalyani, what's your reaction here when you're hearing us talk about running on-prem, running it, in the cloud, if you will, and especially from a startup's perspective?
I'm thinking about like a startup who's selling a very, say, a voice recording app. Okay. In that, if you're storing my voice, is that going to get leaked? Whatever your feature is that going to get leaked? And I think I would like, at this point, the startup would take more responsibility for it rather than like just educating a user about it. But I feel like there has to be a certain level of maturity for a startup to make that decision. And I think it comes over, I want to say two things. It comes over time, and also I want to say it comes through leadership. I think that's more so the trend among startups. It's more like we're talking about awareness and culture right now. But there is obviously a shared model of ownership here.
Yes, that shared responsibility of the cloud, or often the shared fate, are different ways that I've heard it described. Yeah. And what you're pointing out there too, talking about what comes from leadership or what's the security culture, that's a great segue into two final articles I pulled in this week related to Microsoft. So we're going back to Microsoft. One was Say Hello to Windows 11 Administrator Protection. This is about how they're handling privileged admin actions. And then there's another article on Microsoft's guidance to help mitigate Kerberoasting. The first article, the Windows Admin Protection, I thought was really neat example. We'll see how many people agree with me, of finally secure design, because it talks about UAC, or that user account control, which was never really a strict security boundary. It was always more of the security equivalent of Clippy saying, you're about to do something that could have potential, bad consequences security-wise. Are you sure you want to do this? And it was just more of a engage the user and say, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to do this now? Are you sure you want to do this now? And I could go on for another 5 minutes and annoy everyone, much like UAC can annoy people. And as we've seen, you just click through. So in this case, Windows has actually now changed their model for this so that the token that is used to gain the privileges to execute some type of admin command, essentially think of it as sudo, is ephemeral and is done in what they describe as a shadow account. It's not done within the full account and context of your own admin privileges. The idea being that it's going to be ephemeral, one, so it's in and out, it's done. You don't need those privileges lingering. And two, it's just going to ostensibly do what you asked it to do. It's not going to go and be able to do a whole bunch of other types of activities. So it's the type of thing that a lot of people probably will say it's a long time coming within their security design. But I did want to highlight it as there is at least a slow, but maybe we can say steady improvement over time in getting these types of long-lasting Windows security quirks, I'll say, addressed. There is the other article about Kerberoasting, which is what a fun word that is. This is another article from posted by Dave Weston, and I mentioned that more of just kind of there's a meta discussion here we'll have in a moment about the approach to talking about security from Microsoft versus somebody like for other organizations like Google, for that matter, or Apple. But in this case, this Kerberoasting attack is basically, they're saying that it boils down to choose stronger passwords, because Kerberoasting basically says attackers can get in, obtain a hash, and then offline brute force that hash. So choose better passwords or use different designs that don't expose these passwords to be sniffed in the first place, to be obtained. But that does still come down into that idea of let's put burden on the user or blame the user rather than do something that's better by design or better by default here. So I'm not sure how much I can really belabor what's really just a dictionary attack against some hashes. But I don't know, John, was there something else that spoke to you about Kerberoasting?
I'm pulling my stun and going back to the previous article for a second.
Sorry, yeah, I know.
No, it's you. I was going to open my mouth when you were finished before, but I stayed silent too long. I was just going to say, for folks who are trying to understand what is going on here, there's a pretty decent little flowchart in that article. Sort of shows the old path versus the new path and what's going on. I spun up a Win11 box recently. I'm going to have to go and play with this and see how it works for myself. That said. I hinted at this Kerberoasting thing earlier. This feels like it's an operational. Well, it's should be handled by operations. By which I mean, for how many really decades now we've had people doing dictionary attacks against Active Directory. So from that point of view, it ain't nothing new here. But it really comes down to when you're installing these things. You can't just install an AD tree, right? You have to start thinking, how am I going to monitor it? What am I looking for? What's back to our threat model? If you suddenly start seeing a bunch of failed login attempts, maybe a pager goes off, huh? So I think what they're trying to get through here, maybe they've got some settings in Windows now that might help minimize the success of that, or, as you said, increase your password strength.
I also want to add, sure, we're talking about beyond strong passwords here, but also instead of having too many keys in the household and instead of just making the thickest locks to the door, let's just have minimal keys. And that, I think that makes it better than always having strong passwords around. I think that also adds a layer of complexity, and then there's also room for human error at that point.
Yeah, we covered 2 weeks ago, I think, that also speaking of Microsoft, and to your point, their Secure Futures initiative, when they were talking about they got rid of over 700,000 legacy apps that just should have been decommissioned. They decommissioned them, so reduced the attack surface there. They got rid of, I think the number was around 5 million inactive tenants, so reducing surface. And they also talked about, I can't remember the number, but just how many certificates or credentials that they had lingering that were now properly isolated, properly rotated, which speaks very much to your point of how do we get away from, and this is what I was thinking, insecure operations or operational overhead, operational needs, which there is some responsibility there of who's owning deploying this. But it's also in the sense of, did those insecure operations or those operational mistakes, do they come from not following recommended practices? Why weren't those practices just the default out of the box in the first place? Did it come from poor passwords? Can we get rid of the passwords entirely, passkeys, for example? Or should we be passing hashes over the network, or can we be passing signed packets, things that don't even expose the passwords or some manipulation of the transformation of the password, a hash, for example, there. So these are the thoughts that come to me if I think of the CISA, for example. I do have to reference that because it's always secure by design, secure by default. So if we go back to those, AppSec fear in 3 words, secure by design, secure by default, very convenient 3 words. But as we wrap up here, I am curious. I said at the beginning, I asked you what your fear in 3 words would be. And Kalyani, I think you might have hinted at what your answer was, but let's just make sure that we repeat and emphasize what that is.
It's too late. That's one. And the second one I was thinking about is, well, I have 2 words, access denied.
It's got to be 3, so you're violating our design requirements right there. AppSec, come on.
But yeah, I'll stick to it's too late. It's too late.
It's too late. And John, how do you want to take us out with striking AppSec fear in 3 words?
I fumbled and I let mine loose in the intro, but home-rolled encryption. Still gonna stick with that.
Definitely something scary.
That one gives me nightmares for sure. Home-rolled encryption. The number of times I've had those conversations.
Seems like an easy idea at the time, but yeah.
Yeah, and having conversations, well, this time around, Kalyani, I want to say we had a wonderful conversation with you, so thank you for joining us. I want to say thank you to John as well, and thank you to everyone who's been listening. Please do remember to subscribe, share on the socials, check out the show notes, and speaking of, well, not things that strike fear, but one word, check out Sympath by Binster. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly. Oh, look, 3 words.